Greetings, everyone. You are currently entering a new dimension, a realm full of mystery and the unknown. There are only two known constants in this place, two things that you can be assured are still grounded in reality. Number one is that Barry D. Brick is still the supreme ruler of all, and number two, the highest order of knowledge in the land are facts about ants. So, aside from that, nothing else is really, assured. Except for one other thing. I lied. There is a third thing. One Piece is still continuing. One Piece continues for all time, time that has existed, and time that has yet to pass. One Piece is also a constant. Okay. Well, while we're hanging out in this dimension, let's talk about One Piece through the ages, through the centuries. Everybody knows about the Void Century. Well, I guess nobody knows about the Void Century. That's why it's called the Void Century, right? Nobody really knows about it. But the Void Century in One Piece took place from 900 years before the present storyline to 800 years before the present storyline, okay? And, that involves some shenanigans with Joy Boy and Poseidon and the ancient weapons and the world government and the ancient kingdom, and then Toki was born, and then the time fruit and the poneglyphs and some other nonsense. Im-sama was probably there. We don't really know what happened with that. But, that ended 800 years ago. There's a lot of other centuries to go through. So in this video, we're going to be dialing the clock back in One Piece a little bit, and we're going to be looking at every single century interval, I guess, and the major events that happened at that point, and seeing if we can, piece things together as we go. So let's just dive into it here. Let's start simple. Let's just dial the clock back a single century, 100 years before Luffy set out on his journey at Fuchsia Village. What was going on in the world? And we actually know a decent amount of the stuff that happened back then, as early as Little Garden. Okay, so this was right after the Straw Hats reached the Grand Line. They got to Little Garden, they met Dory and Broggy, and we got their backstory there. So around 100 years ago, and I guess I should specify that, a lot of these dates, a few of them, I think actually only two of them, we have an exact, how long ago in an exact number of years, but a lot of times they're just, approximations. So, around 100 years ago, that was when Dory and Broggy were the dual captains of the giant warrior pirates, and they sailed the Grand Line, causing death and devastation wherever they went, right? The mighty war party of Elbaf. And eventually that came to an end when they arrived at Little Garden, and both Dory and Broggy caught these giant sea kings, and they got into an argument over which one was larger than the other. Actually, they didn't get into the argument themselves. There was a little girl on a farm, and she was just there, and she was like, hey, which one did you catch that was bigger? And so Dory and Broggy were like, which one? Wait a second. Well, Broggy, obviously, I don't mean to, say anything bad about your catch, but mine is obviously bigger. Oh, Dory, you idiot. My Sea King is obviously the more, titanic. And so they got into a measuring contest, so to speak, and that eventually ended up staying on Little Garden to fight for their honor, and that's where all of their duels began. I can't remember how many duels they had. I think it was over 60,000 or something like that, but all of that started around 100 years ago, and both of them had a bounty of around 100 million berries, which this was early on in One Piece, so that's pretty impressive. Also, I imagine, there's a form of berry inflation in One Piece, $100 million in 1921 would be worth way more now in 2021, you know what I mean? So maybe there was a form of inflation. Maybe 100 million back then was 500 million right now or something like that. But their bounties are still active, and I guess everybody should really know where they are, but nobody wants to go and kind of bring them in. Mr. 3 tried that, and didn't work out too well for him. But they're still brawling on Little Garden to this day, alright? Now, since Dory and Broggy left their crew of the giant warrior pirates, that also led to all of the other members of that crew kind of being, disorganized, and they ended up getting captured by the Marines. And then they got brought to Marineford to be executed. And this is where Mother Caramel, at age 43, appears in this story, and she kind of speaks to everyone that they should be saved, they could be redeemed, they don't have to be killed right here. And then as soon as that happened, a light ray shone down on Mother Caramel, and everybody was like, oh my, she is truly sent from the heavens themselves to grant mercy on these giants, okay? And so the giants begin weeping, and all the Marines begin weeping. Of course, Mother Caramel has the power of the soul fruit, which was probably what she utilized to give this impression that the heavens themselves are, like, approving of her behavior, right? And we even find out later on during Big Mom's backstory that, yeah, Mother Caramel, from the very beginning, that was all an act, okay? She was never the kindly nun that she portrayed herself as. She was a human trafficker. She would traffic children into the world government like orphans, and they would become members of the Cypher Pole, right? So that's what she was doing, and she even admitted that even back in her 40s when she saved the giant warrior pirates, that was all for, like, an end goal of, you know, making money and, you know, selling giants to the world government. That's how John Giant became the very first giant marine in the story, okay? So that's all where that started there. Also, 100 years ago, around 100 years ago, this is when Morley, the commander of the, not the South, the commander of the Western Blue of the Revolutionary Army branch, he got put into Impel Down. However, he has the push fruit. He has the ability to mold earth around him, so he got put in, I guess, level 5 of Impel Down, but using that power, he was able to create what would eventually become New Kama Land, and then he escaped Impel Down over 100 years ago, okay? And it's funny, because Ivankov was in level 5.5 and turned it into New Kama Land and everything, and like a safe haven for the prisoners, but even Ivankov did not know that it was Morley that was the one that created this place, even though Ivankov and Morley are both part of the Revolutionary Army. But then again, you know, Morley, being a giant, has a much more extended lifespan, okay? So 100 years ago, Morley might not even remember it. He's just like, oh, yeah, there was this one time I got thrown in prison, whatever, I got out in like an hour, who cares, right? So that was about 100 years ago. And also, important to mention, 100 years ago in the story, Dr. Kureha turned 41. Yep, she is 141 years old, so that means 100 years ago, yeah, she turned 41. So good for Dr. Kureha. You know, actually, that is really fascinating, because if we ever have a proper flashback to like 100 years ago, which Oda might do, you know, we get to see what all the kingdoms were like 100 years ago. Obviously, like, the Nefeltari family would have still been ruling over Alabasta, but like it would have been like Vivi's like great-grandfather or grandmother maybe or whatever. But then Dr. Kureha would still be around. Dr. Kureha would still be a constant there, you know, being a doctor and everything like that. That's crazy. Anyway, so that was 100 years ago. We know a decent amount about that stuff with the giant warrior pirates and whatnot, but now let's dial the clock back to 200 years from the start of the story. So this is actually the time period when the Saint Briss from the Briss Kingdom was sailing the Grand Line. Okay, so that was that giant galleon that fell from the sky as the Straw Hats were leaving Alabasta. You know, they have this epic adventure. It's like, okay, we just defeated one of the warlords. We're all set. That's great. Hey, Nami, what direction is the log post pointing at? It's pointing up. Up. What's up? Oh my god! You know, bam! And so that was a great way of Oda showcasing, like, yeah, you can't trust anything on the Grand Line. Giant ships can just fall from the sky. That's normal. Okay? And the St. Briss was a very old galleon. The Straw Hats submerged. They went down to salvage what they could find. They find this old photograph of a woman down there, you know, in the wreckage. Whether or not she has any significance, I really couldn't say. You know, she might have been like the queen of the Briss Kingdom or something. By the way, I don't know if it's supposed to be the Briss Kingdom or the Bliss Kingdom, because it's the Saint... It would be the Saint Bliss, which sounds like more religious, because they're going with like a whole idea with that. So, I don't know, L's and R's in Japanese phonetically are very similar, so I guess it could be the Saint Bliss Kingdom. Whatever. Anyway, I guess it really doesn't matter. That could be the queen, or maybe she was like the captain's wife or something like that. Like, one day I'll get back to you, honey. And then, you know, they ended up in the sky, and they were banished to the land of the floating clouds, which is like the prison sentence of Skypians, you know, where they get sent adrift in these clouds. And this was long before Eneru, or maybe even Gonfall. This was 200 years ago, and, you know, Skypians, I'm assuming, live roughly as long as, like, humans do. Their lifespan's not that much different, so probably, like, Gonfall's ancestor, you know, whatever they did, I'm not really sure. Maybe they were pirates or something, and they got into, you know, the sky, and they started to, like, attack people, and then they banished them to the land of the drifting clouds. They eventually just died of starvation and dehydration, I guess, and exposure, and so the boat was just, like, floating up there in a cloud until eventually the cloud itself just got worn down and I guess evaporated after 200 years, and then it fell down into the blue sea, right? So out of all of the wreckage, the one thing the Straw Hats were able to salvage that actually became relevant was the broken waver. Eventually Pagaya, you know, Konus's father, fixed it at Skypiea. It has a jet dial in it, which is more powerful than the more, you know, common breath dials. Eventually Frankie got a hold of it and modified it into the Shiro Mokuba 1. So the waver is still around. It still is part of the Sunny's, like, like docking system. It's just it doesn't get brought up too often, but it now works in the land and the sea because of Frankie's modifications and stuff. Oddly enough, we find out a lot of stuff about Noland and Kagura during the Jaya and the Skypiea arcs respectfully, but guess what? That has nothing to do with the St. Brice. For a while there, and I kind of knew it didn't, but you know, the giant boat fell from the sky, and then you find out about Noland, and you start thinking like they're connected in some way. No, they're not. Completely separate. I think, you know, Noland, I believe, was from the north. You know, he was from the north, and I think the St. Brice Kingdom was from like the West Blue or something like that, right? So they have nothing to do with each other. It's just that we end up finding like a really old boat, the St. Brice, and then we also find out a really old story about Noland in the same arc, but they are not connected, okay? Also, 200 years ago, this is something very interesting. So this was something that was only really alluded to. We haven't really gotten a proper flashback of this. It would be very brutal if we ever did, but I think this is part of One Piece that maybe Oda might very well explore in the future. So 200 years ago was when the world government finally accepted the Ryugu Kingdom and Fishman Island into, like, the government itself. They were able to attend Reverie 200 years ago. That was the first and only time they attended the Reverie until the current Reverie with Neptune and when the one with Shirahoshi went and, you know, the Neptune brothers and everything like that. And it was talked about, I believe, by Jinbei that before 200 years ago, you know, long time ago, the world government, they considered fishmen and merfolk just fish. That's what they were classified under, right? And they treated them as such, which was horrible. And 200 years ago, something happened at this point. I mean, this was long before Otohime, long before Fish or Tiger. The world government accepted them as an actual, like, you know, intelligent species, finally, and then welcomed them into the world government, and then also ended slavery at that point as well, for the fishmen and the merfolk. However, here we are right now in the story, and there's still slavery, and the world government still mistreats fishmen and merfolk alike. This is still around. This is still a thing. So, yeah, I imagine maybe, and like I said, we don't know the whole story here, so this is something that Oda, I feel, would definitely need to explore. It might be like 200 years ago, there might have been like a precursor to Otohime or Fish or Tiger that, you know, basically went to the world government. Please do not, like, we are intelligent creatures. Quit, like, treating us as fish, basically. You know, it's horrible. And so the world government finally accepted and welcomed them in, but then maybe after they passed away, they went back to their old, like, oh, okay, I guess you could have your own island and stuff, and technically you're a member of the world government, but the fishmen were still, and the merfolk alike, were still being used as slaves. You know, that ties into Mjolsgard's little story, why he went back down to Fishman Island and everything like that. It's possible that Arlong and the other members of his crew that didn't manage to escape might be at Marijois right now. You know, the world government has a lot of things they don't want to let people know about, you know, the world at large. So, yeah, there's definitely still fishmen and merfolk that are slaves in their homeland. I guarantee it, right? Because it's the world government, right? So, yeah, it was 200 years ago where ostensibly this treaty, you know, came into effect, but it's still really messed up. So that needs to be explored, really. Next, we have 300 years ago. The only thing we know about this century is this is when the Germa Double Six had their control over the North Blue for 66 days. That's when the Germa first appeared, and they wiped out all of the rulers of the North, and they ruled for about, like, 2 months, and then something happened. We do not know what. Maybe the world government got involved at that point, and or the North Blue, like, the remnants of the other kingdoms rose up, and they fought back against the Germa, and they were defeated, okay? And then Judge, the distant descendant of the original ruler of the Germa, you know, has his goal in mind to be like, I have to be the one to build the Germa kingdom back up again. And I don't think the Germa kingdom back during that day was as technologically advanced as it is now. That was mostly Judge that did all of that with the cloning tech and everything and the lineage factor. Back then, it was probably just a more maybe medieval kind of kingdom that rose up and managed to be very brutal and defeat the other rulers of the North. But then, like, you know, the children of the kings, like, rose up, like a War of the Five Kings kind of thing, like in Game of Thrones, and fought back against the Germa, right? So they only ruled for 2 months, about 66 days, and then, Judge has it in his head that he wants to, build it back up again. So will he succeed? Probably not. I don't think he will, but that's when that happened 300 years ago. 400 years ago is when we got a lot of stuff going on. All right, so this is when all the stuff with Noland occurred, okay? Noland was sailing around the north. He was an explorer. He discovered the Tontada tribe. He discovered a bunch of different, lost tribes living in the world. But of course, the biggest story and the thing that Noland the Liar, the storybook, is wrote around was when he discovered the City of Gold. The fabled City of Gold, Shandora, or El Dorado, whatever you want to call it. And so he met Kagura there, and they became friends. They met Nola, the snake, who was also born around 400 years ago. Eventually, Noland, he left, and the entire island of Jaya, or half of the island of Jaya, got shot into the sky via the knock-up stream. Noland came back with the king of the Levno Kingdom, I believe it was called, and there was no City of Gold. There was no El Dorado, so the king declared Noland a liar, and he was therefore summarily executed for his fibbing, okay? And he died at the execution stand pleading that, no, the City of Gold did exist. It was real. It must have sank beneath the ocean. That's the only thing I could possibly think of. I mean, maybe there might have been some kind of geothermal explosion at the bottom of the ocean that perhaps launched the island into the sky, leaving only behind jungle. I mean, I guess that's possible as well, but, I'm not a scientist. I'm just a botanist. And the whole crowd is like, what a freaking moron! Geothermal? What the hell is that? Freaking idiot! Kill him! And they just cut him down right there, okay? He apologizes to Kagura. He hopes that at some point in the future, this horrible mistake can be rectified, and it eventually did because of the Straw Hats. Of course, Noland's descendant is Mont Blanc Cricket, that is currently working with Shoujo and Mashra as the Sariyama Alliance, working together to discover, where exactly the City of Gold went, and then through Luffy, they did discover that the Golden Belfry is in the sky, and now they're heading on a new adventure to find the Island of Dreams. So what is that? I don't know, but the age of romance and dreams will never end. That is certainly true, right? I really love the backstory with Noland and Kagura. I did a whole video about that last year, so you can go check that out. But yeah, it was very, very important also to mention, by the way, at that time, though, the Golden City, when Noland found it, when the Shandorians were living there, was already in a state of ruin. It was one of those things where the City of Gold is very, very old, and it was founded, I think, 1100 years ago, and then right at the end of the Void Century, 800 years ago, is when it fell into ruin. So by the time Noland showed up and Kagura was alive, yeah, the City of Gold was still there, but it was still covered in moss and greenery. It was overgrown. There weren't that many Shandorians living there. They were, basically at the edge of their civilization anyway, and then they got blasted into the sky, and then the whole thing there with the Skypians and the wars happened, okay? But it's important to mention, there's a lot of this old stuff here in One Piece, okay? So even during Noland's time, the City of Gold was kind of in ruin, right? Also, 400 years ago was apparently, purportedly, the time when Ryuma slayed the dragon over the flower capital of Wano. This ties back to Oda's previous work of Monsters. I don't think he's going to adapt all of Monsters into One Piece because Monsters took place in, an Old West town, clearly. Maybe Wano went through an Old West phase. Maybe the flower capital looked like, freaking Dodge City back in, the 1800s. I don't know, but the point is that Ryuma slayed a damn dragon, which was probably a dragon that was probably controlled by the Celestial Dragons, the Tenryubito at that time. They probably actually had dragons. They wanted to take over Wano, so they're like, hey, throw our dragons at Wano. That'll make them open up their borders and, join the world government. And Ryuma shut that shit down before you could say Dracarys. He sliced down that freaking dragon. Must have been a magnificent sight to behold. And Ryuma was given the very, very deserved title of Sword God after that. I imagine, as soon as Ryuma hit the ground, he jumps up, slices the dragon's head off, does a really cool spin through the air, sheaths his sword, Shusui, and as soon as he hit the ground, whoever the shogun of Wano was at that point, untitled, unnamed Kozuki clan shogun, he was just like, yeah, you're the sword god now. Forever and for all time, you are now known as the sword god. Ryuma's like, Damn straight. Okay, I'm the sword god. That's how you get that title. Maybe Zoro will slice down Kaido in midair, and then he'll get sword god too! You know, like, we'll see how that happens. Alright. Well, anyway, that was 400 years ago. A lot of stuff occurred then. 500 years ago, not as much that we know of. This is where things begin a little bit more spotty. Oda really hasn't gone back this far, and I feel like the reason for that is because the further back to the Void Century we learn about, the more hints about the Void Century are discovered, and Oda wants to make sure that that's kept as much of a secret as possible. Like, the only hints he wants are, like, the ones he, you know, directly gives us. Like, Toki was directly, like, he even gives a date for Toki. Toki was born 130 years ago. She was born during the Void Century. The first named character that we know of that existed during that time period. Because Joy Boy might not have been his real name, and Poseidon is a title. Like, Poseidon is the title that Shirahoshi has, but that's not her real name. Her real name is Shirahoshi, right? So that might not have been their real names. That might have just been titles. Kozuki Toki, or Toki Amasuki, was her birth name, was the first named character born during that time period. But beyond that, we don't really know much more. So 500 years ago, though, the only thing we know about this century is Ors. Ors had his big band of ancient giants back in the day. They were very formidable. They would go to island and just stomp out all opposition, essentially, like a massive raiding party of giants, giants amongst giants that were basically demons or devils. However, it all came to an end around 500 years ago when they were traveling through a northern land, maybe the ice continent that's talked about every once in a while in One Piece, and doesn't matter how big you are, you can still die of exposure and frostbite and hypothermia if you're wearing nothing more than a loincloth, which Ors doesn't seem that smart, so he's probably just like back in the day like, alright, let's go raid ice continent now, bam, bam, man, it's cold, crap! And then Ors died of exposure. Eventually, Moria and Hogback got a hold of his corpse. Kind of want to see how that happened, how they even towed that thing back to Thriller Bark, threw him in a giant freezer until Luffy eventually showed up. Moria took out Luffy's shadow, threw him into Ors, and that's where we have that arc right there. But Ors purportedly died around 500 years ago. Now, as an extension of that, we don't know really anything about, like, the 600 years to 500 years ago. The only thing that we know is at some point during that century, Ors was born. Because Ors was given an age upon his death in the Vivaricard data book. He was 159 years old, okay? It was only said that it was around 500 years ago that Ors died of exposure in the Arctic, so we don't know the exact number of years, but 159 years before that, so around 600 years ago, going around town, that's when Ors was born, alright? And that's pretty much all we know about from 600 years ago to 400 years ago, before we get into the Noland and Kagura and Ryuma stuff. You know, I like to think this was the time period when the ancient giants were the most powerful, and these warring, like, you know, raiding parties that, like, Ors was part of were everywhere. The world government was probably trying to contain them, you know, at this point in history. There was the giant skull on Onigashima that used to be an ancient giant, I believe, like a living creature, and that thing was huge. Like, Ors was pretty big 500 years ago, but that skull was even bigger. So there's two ways of looking at this. You could say that skull on Onigashima belonged to a creature that existed like thousands of years ago, or, here's another way of looking at it, maybe Ors was one of the smaller ancient giants. Like, he was very strong and very devastating to a human, but what if there was like a king of the ancient giants around 500, 600 years ago, and the king of the ancient giants was like the size of a mountain? Like, that would be appropriate to the size of, like, the skull was the size of a mountain. Like, that is something you really need to understand. Like, that mountain skull, that, like, the skull of this thing, everything that's happening right now, like, literally, Kaido and Big Mom and Luffy and Kid and Killer and Law were fighting on top of the skull of this creature. This thing is massive, alright? Like, this full body thing would be bigger than a mountain, bigger than an island. That the skull itself is a mountain. So, like, this thing would have to have been giant, like maybe about the size of Zunisha, or the size of those things at Thriller Bark. We don't know, but yeah, maybe that was like the king of the ancient giants that lived back during that time period, you know, maybe around the area of Wano, like, you know, lived on Onigashima and then died, or then, you know, Ors was also referred to as the continent puller. I don't think Ors himself could pull continents. I don't think he was big enough for that, but maybe he was given that epithet because some of the ancient giants were that big that they could toe continents, and so Ors just had the title because people feared him because he was huge, right? From a human's perspective, you know, it doesn't matter if, you know, Ors was the smallest ancient giant or whatever. From a human's perspective, they would be continent polars regardless, right? So anyway, that was 500 and 600 years ago. 700 years ago, the only thing we know about that time period is that was when the bridge in Tequila Wolf, or I guess Tequila Wolf itself, was created, okay? The world government, for some reason we do not know, it was probably some stupid reason that they don't even remember, ordered a great bridge to be built in the east. Where from and where to, we do not know. They were just ordered to build it, and so with you know, slave labor over the past 7 centuries, that bridge was constructed. A lot of people died along the way, until finally the Revolutionary Army showed up and liberated the country, so it is free now. The bridge is stopped production, and then the people can go and live amongst, I don't even know, because like literally they would be slaves taken from other lands. You know, they didn't like grow up their entire lives on Tequila Wolf, although maybe some of them might have. That's the thing, like some of them might have literally, like their grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, like families and families of slaves of the world government were raised on this bridge throughout like the centuries. That could have been a thing. So yeah, it's insane, but yeah, that's the situation. It's free now. I like to think that the world government, like whoever Celestial Dragon ordered it, it was some frivolous thing. It was like some ridiculous thing where like the Celestial Dragon, like, I demand to go to this island. I want to take a nice pleasant carriage ride from this island to this other island. And they're like, well, you can't take a carriage ride. I mean, that would take forever to build a bridge. Build a bridge! And they're like thousands of miles? Yes! Okay, that's gonna take a really long time. Do it, for I am a Celestial Dragon! That was probably one of the first instances, like 700 years ago, this was only 100 years after the Void Century ended, of the Celestial Dragons exerting their absolute objective power in the world, right? Something ridiculous. I mean, that would be like if I'm in Australia and I'm like, build a bridge to California. That's not possible. Build a bridge to California from Australia. It's not hard. And then they get to work. Well, anyway, that's when that started 700 years ago. I definitely want to find out the origin of that. Every now and then, Oda goes back to Tequila Wolf. During the flashback with Odin and Roger, they sailed by it as well. So he references it every now and then. I think we're going to get a backstory with that, at least the reason why it began construction. And it's probably going to be for something really, really stupid. Like the Celestial Dragons just awash in their abject power. You know, they're just gonna be like, yeah, just build a bridge. I want to walk there someday. And then they completely forget about it, and the bridge is under construction. They don't even know why it's under construction anymore. That's just the frivolry of the world government. 800 years ago, this is when the Void Century ended. Shandora was stated to have fallen during this time period. Shandora probably fought against the rising power of the world government, and they lost. So maybe like most of their fighting force, most of their warriors, their army got wiped out, and the rest retreated back to their homeland, and they were still able to live there, but their numbers were greatly diminished, and they weren't able to keep up with maintaining the City of Gold, but they were still able to live there in relative seclusion from the world government. The world government, of course, was officially formed at the end. This is something I just realized when writing this all down today. So the 20 kings came together, right? And they formed the world government. I did a whole video about that not too long ago. Okay, but the Void Century lasted 100 years. So I highly doubt all of these 20 kings were extremely long-lived, and they existed for that whole century waging a war. So that makes me start to think, the beginning of the Void Century, something happened that maybe didn't even involve the 20 kings. Maybe something happened with that ancient kingdom whose name cannot be named. The ancient weapons were also, of course, to be mentioned, built during the Void Century at some point. So we're kind of going back 900 years ago now. But at that point, you know, the ancient kingdom started to take over the world, and maybe at the very beginning of it, like maybe let's say 880 years ago or 870 years ago during the Void Century, the world government maybe started off as like the good guys fighting back against this kingdom with all these ancient weapons trying to take over the world. And then over the course of the decades, while this war waged on between the ancient kingdom and the world government, eventually maybe it got to the point where the world government had like, oh, we've devastated this kingdom, and now we can take the ancient ancient weapons for ourselves. And then maybe at the tail end, the very tail end of the Void Century, that is when the 20 Kings got involved, that actually founded it. That is when Joy Boy and Poseidon got involved, and the promise was made with the Noah, okay? And then the ancient weapons were all lost to the world from the world government, and nobody knows where they're at. And so the world government did come out victorious at the end of this, but not as victorious as they would have wanted to, which is why they have the desire to rule the world and find the weapons and everything like that, and whatever the One Piece is on Laugh Tale and whatnot. All right, so to summarize again, at least my idea, 900 years ago, roughly 900 years ago exactly, this ancient kingdom basically might have ruled over everything. Their advanced technology created the three ancient weapons, Pluton, Poseidon, Uranus, okay? They used those weapons to maybe at first it maybe to protect their kingdom, but maybe it ended up being like them ruling the world, okay? Then maybe the world government or the precursors to the world government arose to fight back, and then they won, and they captured the ancient weapons, and then they started to have their own power fantasies of like, now we can rule the world, and then Joy Boy showed up and then stopped them, scattered the ancient weapons to the four corners of the world or whatever, and then the world government didn't know where they were, and so that's when the 20 Kings finally allied together, like, we will forge the world government so we will someday reclaim what is rightfully ours, and they all raise their swords to create the WG, and also to fight against the will of D, the clan of D, that was probably started by Joy Boy himself, okay? That's just my idea, though. We'll see. That's just a theory. A One Piece theory. Not thanks for watching yet. We still have some stuff to cover. So, going back, oh, and also, 900 years ago, at some point around 900 years ago, of course, that was when the poneglyphs were also created by the Kozuki clan. That was when Wano itself was isolated from the world. You know, that a lot of the stuff that we're addressing right now in the Wano arc, you know, all began between 900 and 800 years ago. 1,000 years ago is when Zunisha was born, a 1,000-year-old elephant, but it was also mentioned that Zoe was on the back of Zunisha at that time, okay? You have to understand just how massive Zunisha is. Probably even as like a newly born elephant, it was still really huge, right? And so maybe there was like a smaller like village of the minks on the back of Zunisha, like a happy little elephant walking around the ocean, like, yeah, happy little elephant with a little tiny village on its back. And then as it got bigger and bigger into adulthood, it now has the entire country of Zoe on its back, okay, with like multiple cities and a towns and everything like that, and a water irrigation system and the whale forest and all that stuff. But even back during the day, Zoe was still on the back of Zunisha, and the minks did live there. That was also around the time the minks isolated themselves from the rest of the world. And then finally, 1,100 years ago is when the Shandora city was built. Robin reads this information when she was in Skypiea. She found the old ruins, and she read that, and it's like 1,100 years ago, Shandora was built, and it prospered at that time. So Shandora, the history there is built 1,100 years ago, devastated by the world government probably 800 years ago, and then shot into the sky by the knock-up stream 400 years ago. So that's the story of Shandora. It goes back even further. 4,000 years ago is when the Palace of Alubarna was built, and 5,000 years ago is the oldest point in One Piece that we know of so far, where the Tree of Knowledge was planted at Ohara. But that's just further back stuff. I don't think Oda's going to address, I mean, I would love for him to, but I don't think he's going to address anything like, you know, 10,000 years ago this happened, 4,000 years ago this happened, you know. I don't think we're going to go back that far, probably to the Void Century, and I think by necessity, we would also have to go a little bit further back even from that to find out what happened before the Void Century, to really understand why the Void Century mattered so much, and why the world government scrubbed everything from that time period away from all their books and history and lore, right? But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and now fare thee well from the dimension of... Oh wait, no, we can't leave yet. We can't leave yet because ant facts! Go! Ant facts! Facts about ants and other insects, but mostly ants. Okay, so this is, you know how the intro of Ant Facts has always said, like, you know, facts about ants and other insects, but mostly ants? Well, we're not actually talking about, we are talking about ants, but we're not talking about other insects. We're actually talking about fungi in this one, you know, because this is something very fascinating I knew about for a while, but, you know, might as well mention it now because it does involve ants. I think a lot of people might be aware of this. There is a type of fungus. There is no way in hell I'm going to be able to pronounce it, so here you go. There's a type of fungus that invades the brains of ants, kind of overrides their central nervous system and turns them into effectively zombie ants. That's right, not just ants. We've talked about prehistoric ants and giant ants and tiny ants and army ants and fire ants and lava ants, but now we're getting into zombie ants. You know what? Upon doing so many episodes of Ant Facts, I kind of just want a video game just called Ants. Not like the movie Ants. You know, I prefer Bug's Life myself, but whatever. I want like a game where you can pick a different species of ant, right? There's like, 70 species of ant you can pick in the game, and you all have a different adventure, right? But you're like an anime ant. Like, if you pick fire ant, you can throw fireballs and shit, right? If you pick the army ant, you got these giant mandibles to like crush stones and stuff, right? I want an ant RPG. Not SimAnt, alright? An Ant RPG. Yeah, I should play some SimAnt. It's been a while. I should do an Ant Facts on SimAnt. Anyway, back to what I was talking about. Fungus, okay? So basically what happens is this fungi gets into the brain of an ant, overrides its central nervous system, and basically forces the ant to get up as high as it can into the best possible, like, situation for the fungus to emerge and spread its spores. Alright? So this is a fungus taking control of an ant, and then it latches onto a leaf on top of like a tree or something. It's like compelled, like I am compelled to walk up this tree. I am compelled to, it's called the death bite, like to bite down on this leaf with such force that even after the ant's biological functions cease, after the ant is technically dead, it's just secured itself to this leaf so intensely it won't fall. And then eventually the fungus sprouts out, cracks open the skull of the ant. I guess ants don't have skulls. Cracks open the exoskeleton of this ant. It comes out, and then it spreads its spores across the area. So this is fascinating to me because this is like, I know, fungus, they don't have a brain. I mean, they do kind of like, a nuclei or whatever, but like they are not sentient or anything. And yet taking over the ant, it's like the fungus does have a will to like compel the ant to get into optimal position to release more of the fungus. This is so weird to me. This is so fascinating to me. It makes me wonder, like, okay, it's taking over the central nervous system and controlling it. Like, do fungus have a level of awareness that we're unaware of? Like, because that's something I feel like we should be aware of at some point. Like, the idea of having, like, a fungus growing out of a head, like, if it's something adapts to humankind in, like, centuries from now or something, fungus take us over and, like, we're compelled to walk up on top of hills and just sit there and die, and then the fungus spreads, like, that's pretty terrifying, right? This could be the only way we might actually have a zombie apocalypse. It's through mushrooms. Who would have guessed? But that's how it happens. All right. Well, yeah, that was Ant Facts today. Ant Facts! All right, I gotta go ask some deep philosophical questions about fungi, so, yeah, you have a good one, guys. This will be Tekking, signing out. Yeah.